I'm Reverend Tara Steele, and the heart of my ministry here at the center is building community. So when I was asked to explore the topic, the multicultural America, myth or aspiration, I jumped right in. This talk this morning is an invitation to reflect on two questions. The first is, what does it mean to be multicultural? And the second, what does it mean to be American? And I invite all of you to reflect on those in the context of that beautiful song, Called to Be, that Chris just sang. As a religious scientist, someone grounded in the science of mind, I know two things for sure. That we are all here to be perfect expressions of the One, and that each one of us is doing the best we can. These beliefs reflect a deep acceptance of myself and of everyone else in this thing we call the human family. And the more that we recognize our unique, individualized, divine expressions, the more we can accept that love and acceptance for ourselves and for others. Here's what Ernest Holmes, the founder of Science of Mind, has to say. The thing that shall establish unity is that each family group of the human race shall respect the individual differences of others, while at the same time cooperating with them. We each have an individual part to play in the great scheme of things, and the most valuable thing that anyone can do is to be a little more certain each day that we are meeting life with a deeper understanding and sympathy for others, with a greater sense of love. That's our invitation as religious scientists. So let's start with considering the concept multicultural. Get this off of here. The United States is a nation of immigrants. From the very first inhabitants, those we call with capital N, capital A, Native Americans who crossed the Bering Straits, we've all been coming to this country from somewhere. The first European immigrants arrived in the 1600s seeking religious freedom. And until 1850, there weren't many immigrants, with one exception. The largest forced migration in human history took place from the 1500s to about 1860. More than 12 million Africans were forcibly delivered to the New World, about 500,000 arriving here in the United States. After 1850, the number of voluntary immigrants started jumping up dramatically. The millions of Irish and German who came to these United States fleeing famine and looking for greater opportunities, ironically were opposed by some of those who were already here. Those who came to seek religious freedom suddenly found that they were very anti-Catholic in their views, as fears about race and space and jobs and all kinds of things started to arise. In the 1880s, we reacted to the Chinese who were coming to the gold fields to work there and had another anti-immigration law passed. Even today, we struggle with what it means to allow or not allow immigrants into this country. On the surface, as we look at all these waves of immigration, as we look at all the different cultures and races and ethnicities in our country, it would appear that, well, of course, we are multicultural. But for me, simply having a variety of people between our borders does not a multicultural nation make. From the first immigrants across the Bering Straits to the English immigrants seeking religious freedom, to the forced immigration of Africans, to European and Chinese immigrants seeking better lives for themselves and their families, to today's refugees seeking asylum and safety. We have a lot of people. We are physically multicultural in this country. But often there is tolerance rather than welcome for those tired and poor who come to our golden shores. Sometimes we are told, of course you are welcome, so long as you become American, whatever American means. And sometimes even the immigrants themselves take on that belief. I'm a second-generation American. All my grandparents came from Europe. My mother's family came from Sweden. My grandfather was a shoemaker, and my grandmother was a licensed vocational nurse. They met here and married, and my mother was born in Chicago. When I was in elementary school, my guess is I heard something in a history class. I came home to my mom and asked her, "What's it like to be a Swedish American?" She looked at me and immediately said, "Tara, I am not a Swedish American. I am an American." For many, especially in my parents' generation, that was the truth. And that was the melting pot image of multicultural America. Despite that, I got little bits of Swedish culture. Every night when it was time to come to the dinner table, someone ran around saying, "Varsågod, varsågod," which means, in my mind, come eat. It's here, it's ready. And we celebrated Christmas on Christmas Eve. How many of you have Christmas dinner on Christmas Eve? And how many on Christmas Day? See, we're multicultural already. As part of that preparing the smorgasbord for Christmas Eve, we made little teeny tiny Swedish meatballs the day before, and we meticulously counted them out so that we could proudly report at Christmas dinner exactly how many meatballs there were that year. So I did have a little bit of Swedish experience in my life. Later, when I traveled to Sweden on business, I found that culture runs even more deeply. I was staying at a hostel, and they had a marvelous buffet, smorgasbord, for breakfast every morning. And to my huge delight, I could sample pickled herring for breakfast. I heard an ooh over here somewhere. And that was the response of many of the other Americans who were staying at that youth hostel. "Oh, how could she possibly eat herring for breakfast?" Because deep in me, I'd grown up with pickled herring. That was part of who I was. And I was still American. So why do I share that story? It reflects another part of what multicultural means. It points to that melting pot where we haven't quite melted altogether. I don't know if you all remember when you first saw as a child those marvelous 48 crayon boxes of crayons with all those colors and assortments in them. I so wished our family could afford to get me one of those sets of crayons. And how tragic it would have been had I gotten them and then accidentally left them in my backpack in the station wagon on a hot summer day so that they melted into a gray glob. That's a melting pot where the unique colors and qualities and skills and talents are smushed and melted together and lose their integrity. Recently, I prefer a different metaphor. That metaphor is a tossed salad, where each of the ingredients has its own taste and flavor and texture, and I can savor them as I eat, even as they all make up the salad. So if there are cultural differences like clothing or faith tradition, native language, or ones that aren't quite so obvious, like liking pickled herring or having a different idea of what family means, does that make us less American? Holmes points again and again in his writings to oneness, to the oneness and commonality that underlies all creation. For him, unity is not a melting pot. Here's what he says in 10 ideas that make a difference. We are all so much alike inside. We all do want people to like us, and we want to feel that we enter into their lives in a vital way. We all have similar needs, hopes, and longings. This does not mean that we do not have different opinions, for we are all individuals. Each is a person in his own or her own right, but unity does not mean uniformity. Basically, this would indicate we should get along together in immediate personal family life, as well as in the entire human family. Unity does not mean uniformity. We should all get along together in the entire human family. Here is Holmes again, speaking even more explicitly. The rosebush is not a grapevine, nor is the Japanese a New Englander, but the rosebush and the grapevine are rooted in one common soil, and they draw their being from it. And so the Japanese and the New Englander are rooted in the one common divine life, which has seen fit to make its expression a little different in each. And there is plenty of room for all the varieties of expression and for the various groups both in the home and in the world. Different thoughts and ideas are inherent to the nature of life. I would add to the joy and the beauty of it. We need this variety. But back of it all, we need a sympathetic understanding of others. To listen without prejudging the diversity, the different life experiences, different educational and economic status, even different opinions, to listen without prejudging. That's the invitation of our teaching of oneness. That's the invitation and the aspiration of a multicultural nation. And I know from frequent personal experience, that's not necessarily easy. Just last week, some friends were visiting from Reading, where there's a wonderful center for spiritual living. That was where I started in this teaching. And Diana asked me for the order of service. So I gave it to her, and then she said, I love that you start the service with music. I'm so tired of that bell that we use. Up in Reading, there is a beautiful cast iron bell, just exquisite, that has its own stand, and practitioners are trained how to sound it in a sacred way. That's how we open our sacred space as the service begins. So you can imagine how I felt when she said, we're thinking about getting rid of the bell at the beginning of service. I just cringed. How? But before I could start arguing with her and telling her how absolutely wrong and sacrilegious and horrid her ideas were, she reminded me that she and her husband are teachers. And for them, there's nothing sacred about sounding a bell. It starts classes. It ends recess. It calls people to the end of the day and dismisses them. That's what a bell is for them. I still don't think that they should get rid of their opening bell. And I understand why someone else might see it differently, and I'm okay with that. Again, a practice of inclusion, of listening, of interest and curiosity, not because you have to change someone else's mind or change your own, but because it's so important to be able to hear people who are a little bit different. So as we aspire to be a truly vital multicultural nation, appreciating our diversity and our unity, there is another question to consider. What does it mean to be American? How do we find common ground? Here are some basic suggestions from our founder, Ernest Holmes, on how to begin, and he does not mince words. The first is poetic and important. Behind all is a unity. Through all is a diversity. Saturating all is a divinity. I invite you to breathe into those words and close your eyes as I read them again. Fundamental principle of science of mind. Behind all is a unity. Through all is a diversity. Saturating all is a divinity. And Holmes offers a strategy that helps us to live with a sense of our common humanity. This from the Science of Mind textbook. Again, not mincing words. One of the first things to do is to love everybody. If you have not done this, begin to do so at once. No exceptions. There is always more good than bad in people, and seeing the good tends to bring it forth. What we focus on does become more alive in our world. And we don't say all the good people are expressions of the divine. We say all are individualized expressions of the divine. It is ours to see that, to call that into clearer presence in each and all. So, second question, what does it mean to be an American? I invite you to think about that question over the coming week. There are many ways to answer it. My understanding in reading a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, written by Arlie Hochschild, a sociology professor at UC Berkeley, has expanded a bit, and I came to a place at the end of this talk I was surprised to find. The author realized that, like so many of us, as a Berkeley professor, she lived in a bubble of like-mindedness. She heard and knew very little about the opinions of others that were different than ours, including, for example, people who lived in red states. So she decided that she needed to understand more about those who are different, to try and find ways to bridge that division where each group has its own bubble and knows the truth in this little box. What she said was her goal was to discover ways across what she called an empathy wall. That barrier of her own views and opinions and assumptions about what was true and what was right and what was correct, that made it impossible for her to hear and see people who had different views and different experiences. What I found striking about her writing was how difficult that was for her to do. She couldn't believe early in the 5 years that she spent off and on in Louisiana that people could actually hold some of the views they held because it didn't make sense to her. How could they feel that way when a big chunk of their state budget had to come from the federal government to be balanced? How could they possibly do that? Because she was seeing with her opinions, her judgments, her experience, not theirs. Eventually, in part thanks to a marvelous, very outspoken wife of a Baptist minister, she began to realize that the challenge of her empathy wall was that she was maintaining it by her assumptions and her prejudices. And so long as it was up, she would not see or hear. So she started to just listen, to actually attempt to hear what the other person was saying without immediately reacting to it, denying it, attacking it, or just drowning it out with her own ideas. Besides helping the empathy wall to drop by listening in that way, she also found common ground because she described that process to the preacher's wife, and the wife of the preacher said, "I can do that too. In that we are alike." Arlie Hochschild is still a liberal Berkeley professor. She didn't change her opinions, but she changed how she could be with someone who was different and actually allow that other to be seen and heard. I think in our country, it's time for us to stop the othering and to start ourselves being seen and heard and giving that gift to other people. And if we don't, if we continue to feel like we don't get what's happening, that it's all strange and difficult, and we, in whatever bubble we're in, feel like we are strangers in our own land, we have to start to argue and defend and make wrong the other because we don't feel safe ourselves. So there are gifts not only to others in this bridging process, but to ourselves as we begin to see some common ground. So having read Strangers in Their Own Land, I began to ask people around town, what does it mean to be American? And I got a variety of answers. And interestingly, they had nothing to do with where we came from, what language we originally spoke, the color of our skin, or even our citizen status. What I found was that there were some values that ultimately people ended up with, those fundamental truths that we're celebrating this 4th of July weekend. This is our common ground. I'm going to read this slowly because at first I went, oh, yeah, I know. But listen to these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These values, I believe, are our common ground. Sometimes they feel trite and old and unrealistic, but this is what we are called to know as Americans. Some of us love hamburgers. Others think tofu is the perfect food. Church, synagogue, temple, mosque, center, or out in nature, Each of us meets something transcendent in our own unique way, or not. And as Americans, we believe life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are unalienable rights, granted at the moment of our birth, not something that must be earned. There are still challenges in our world, and simple answers like love and respect sometimes seem naive. And I still think that's the way we must walk. When I was in practitioner training, I adopted a practice of feeling and connecting with the divine as a person came toward me to ask for prayer. And I made sure that I had that connection before I spoke a word of prayer. That practice of seeing the divine in myself and the other and connecting at that level is a very powerful practice. In these times, I believe it is an even more important practice outside of the prayer room, in our daily lives, in our families, our communities, our neighborhood, our country, and our world. I invite you in the coming week to experiment with the practice of seeing the beloved, the divine, in all the people you meet. Bring that sense of namaste. The God in me bows to the God in you, to all of your experiences this coming week. Notice how it is, how it feels, what shifts. That namaste to each and all is the heart of the multicultural America. Now it's time to pray together. In honor of the 4th of July holiday, I will share a prayer written by Ernest Holmes, my prayer for my country. As I speak the prayer, I invite you to pay attention to any phrases where you push back, say, no, that isn't possible. Remember, we are religious scientists. What we think and what we believe affects and influences our world. So if you're saying, oh, yeah, I like all that prayer except not that line. That line's never going to happen. That line's never going to happen for you. We are religious scientists. We don't just pray, but prayer is a central part of who we are. So notice as I read this prayer. And if there are phrases, and there may not be, if there are phrases that you push back against, I invite you in the coming week to sit with those phrases, to contemplate them, and to begin to affirm that they are so. Just a little bit of them. Affirm that, yes, it is so. That's the practice of a religious scientist who knows that there are infinite possibilities always available. There to be known, there to be realized. And if you want to have the prayer at home, you can find it on our homepage. Alan generously put it up for me last night. And you can print it and read it and reflect on it, that it may be so. So let's rev up the power of our tradition of affirmative prayer. If you will join me in these words of Ernest Holmes. Believing in the divine destiny of the United States of America and in the preservation of liberty, security, and self-expression for all, I offer this, my prayer for my country. I know that divine intelligence governs the destiny of the United States of America, directing the thought and the activity of all who guide its affairs. I know that success, prosperity, and happiness are the gifts of freedom and are the divine heritage of everyone in this country. I know that success, prosperity, and happiness are now operating in the affairs of every individual in this country. I know that divine guidance enlightens the collective mind of the people of this country, causing it to know that economic security may come to all without the loss of either personal freedom or individual self-expression. I know that no one can believe or be led to believe that freedom must be surrendered in order to ensure economic security for all. The all-knowing mind contains the answer to every problem which confronts this country. I know that every leader in this country is now directed by this all-knowing mind and has the knowledge of a complete solution to every problem. Each is compelled to act upon this knowledge to the end that abundance, security, and peace shall come to all. And I know that this spiritual democracy shall endure, guaranteeing to everyone in this country personal liberty, happiness, and self-expression. In gratitude for the power and truth of this word, I release it into the law of mind, which always affirms, knowing it to be done and done well. And together we say, and so it is.